have to tell you that Elisabeth and I have given talks for 6 years? Definitely Kwanzaa talks for at least that long. And I tend to be on the anal side. Elisabeth tends to be sometimes on the anal side. And when I mentioned to her that we were going to do this, she came to me with all of the Kwanzaa talks that we had ever done, the stack. She had the bulletin, all of the notes, all of the music, all of the biblical and other readings, and they were all dated and paginated, and she said, "Here you go." And I said, "Oh, I wasn't going to talk about any of those."
So here we go. Kwanzaa, our first task in approaching another culture, another tradition, another people, says Marjorie Bowens-Wheatley, is to take off our shoes. For the place we are approaching is holy, else we find ourselves treading on another's dream. More seriously still, we may forget that God was there before we even arrived. Our first task in approaching another tradition like Kwanzaa is to take off our shoes, for the place we are approaching is holy.
Part of my family roots originate in Sierra Leone. For more than 3 centuries, shipbuilders sold ships to traders, and they brought people unwillingly from Africa over to America. That over 3 centuries of time left such an effect that by the 4th century, Africans continued to experience an emotional, physical, and economic impact.
My family roots originate in the Netherlands, where over 3 centuries ago, the Dutch were the first to build the slave ships that brought people from Africa to America.
And then we met. So after the 4th century following the slave trade, there was serious impact. There was loss of identity, which initially resulted from having your family members sold at public auction, being separated from them. Because of prejudicial treatment, African Americans as a whole experienced despair, negative self-image, confusion about their image, and it was serious enough to have even affected their life expectancy. And then in the early to mid-1900s, there was a migration of African Americans throughout the United States. My family moved from Kansas City to the San Francisco Bay Area because people were hoping desperately that they could turn the tide from the effects of slavery, that they would be able to find decent jobs, that they would be able to have decent living situations, and that they would no longer be treated in an abusive manner. However, as the slide coming up will show you, a French artist by the name of J.R. Created a mural of the Memphis sanitation workers that says, "I am a man." It was the realization that that hope in the migration had not come to fruition, that the discovery that cultural racism was still going on was true.
Dr. Kurenga was a doctoral student in Los Angeles, and so he witnessed the riots and the violence that were going on at the time. And he said African Americans need a cultural revolution before we need a violent revolution. And so he created Kwanzaa, a way to restore the self-image and strengths of Africans as a people.
And in order to really, really get Kwanzaa, which is why I wanted to talk about it as opposed to just the principles, in order to understand it, you really have to understand 2 things. One of them is what oppression does, what violence does when someone is deeply hurt or deeply affected. It strips away a piece of who you were. Victims of rape understand that. Victims of any kind of abuse understand that. And eventually, one becomes stripped of what identifies you as you, and you're not so sure of who you are or were anymore. And if you can hold on to the fact that out of that, the result was a people of what happens to a people, what happens to a person when they've been abused, when they've been oppressed, when they've been separated, when they've been mistreated over time.
Sometimes what we forget to do is to walk ourselves as closely as we can into the far-reaching effect of history and the way that we have treated one another.
So the idea behind Kwanzaa is the restoration of the person and the restoration of community as a whole, of the people, and the conviction that the restoration, the transformation is everyone's transformation, everyone's restoration, or no one's. Inherent within the practice of Kwanzaa are the restorative powers that we need to call upon in order to be a people of strength and in order to be a people of joy.
So Kwanzaa is created as a way for people to restore their innate sense of wisdom, dignity, and power. It is a celebration of freedom, of free space that Africans needed to honor themselves, to remember their history, to reflect on what's happening right now, and to recommit themselves to create a different future. In the liberation struggle of the 60s, Africans dared to imagine the face of the future, the possibilities and promise of a new history of humankind, a new world, a new man and new women to conceive and construct that world. And these new women and men would be rooted in values that represent the best of what it means to be both African and human in the fullest sense. During Kwanzaa, Africans are called to ask, what are the moral obligations to ourselves and others? What are our obligations to the poor and less powerful, the vulnerable, the oppressed, suffering and struggling peoples of the world, and to the well-being of the world itself? And how do we, Africans as a people, honor our role as moral and social leaders in such a way that we become the role models of future generations? So how do you weave this reimagining of a different world, the remaking of a different world, into a day-to-day practice, a way of life that actually can bring about such a transformation?
Sounds heavy. So what Dr. Karenga did was to choose 7 principles, the Nguzo Saba. And the 7 principles serve as the overarching framework as a way to live one's life. The principles focus on family, the individual, community, and culture. But they also have a really broad meaning for what goes on in the world and the work that we have to do around that. The principles are reflected upon, and then you do the work. It's not that you just read about them every day and you just look at them, but you actually do something. And they become an internal part of one's own daily practice. It's also not about what you receive. It's not like Christmas presents, what's Santa gonna bring me? There are definitely times where people may make things. My daughter made soap for Elisabeth with scents and flowers in it. But you literally work the principle. They call you to look beyond yourself, and they call you to look for a greater meaning. And I'll give you an example of that. The Montessori office was getting messy and needed some organization and some cleanup. And there was a lot of disorganization right behind the desk where I often sit. And so the past few days, there was just a lot going on with Christmas and stuff, and so I sat on the other side of the desk rather than where I'd normally sit, and I kept looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, that really needs a lot to do. Well, the day came up, day before yesterday, which was Ujima, and Ujima is collective work and responsibility. So on Ujima, I sat myself on the other side of the desk that I had been avoiding, and I started to clean and clear and organize, and I texted Sarah, and I told her what I was doing, and Sarah came in, and the two of us were working in there and trying to get it organized, and Gloria at one point helped us find the smoke detector that was going off. Alan came to try to change them out. It was like, there you go. And then yesterday is the day that's reflected in the middle. which is cooperative economics. And on that day, I did not visit the common large coffee place, I won't mention the name, that I usually go to. It is a day when you do things that are local, where you give locally, where you pay attention to what you should be contributing to in your own community, in your local community. So we went to a place called Julie's, and we went to a place called The Local, and that's where we had our coffee, and Dutch people have coffee all the time, so we went a few times back and forth all through the day. Yesterday. And then I also called Unity, and I went online because I needed to revisit my pledge, because I thought that's another piece for me. And I realized that this past pledge year, I had a pledge, and I also wrote a check very often on Sundays in addition to my pledge. And so I thought, okay, so let me look at that. So I added up what I had been writing in a check, and I added that to my pledge, and decided that I would continue to do the exact same thing, but it upped my pledge by what I pledged and what I had been writing by check, so that I can now increase that for the next year. And I decided that I needed to own that. I needed to own the fact that I could do it. And so I made sure that I called and I emailed so that I could solidify the commitment that I had. And why don't you read that?
Cindy has this quote that says, "Every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want."
So I had to walk that talk yesterday about this place here. And then there's also the importance of ancestors in Kwanzaa. Underpinning the restoration is the knowing that you have to look back. And looking back is not looking back at where did I mess up, what didn't I do. It's who was back there who started the way for me. Who was back there, who made a contribution that allows me to be able to go forward. And we call them waymakers, people who made the way. Who are our waymakers? And we look at that. We look at the ancestral waymakers. We look at the people who are our older ones in our community and how we need to respect them. We often forget to do that. Sometimes older ones just become a pain in the neck to us, rather than us recognizing that they were here doing some work before us, and that they have wisdom to contribute, and that we should be honoring who they are, making a seat for who they are, making sure that they have food to eat. I watched Jason do that with Sue Schuler the other day, where he sat with her and made sure that she had what she needed to be able to sit down and eat. And that's what we should be doing. That's the kind of honor that we should be paying to our older ones, and that's inherent within the principles of Kwanzaa.
Now, within most of the white communities, we do really not have a practice of honoring our ancestors. Even though we say that every generation is working towards creating a better future for the next generation. And we hear parents say that. I want my child to have everything he or she needs to create a better future for themselves. And as parents, we work and we sacrifice sometimes, and we give of ourselves. And a lot of times we feel that the good that we have given does not always get recognized. Sometimes it is taken for granted. And we will even say that the next generation seems a little entitled, right? But how much do we ourselves speak in our homes, at the dinner table, at other places, of the ways our parents made a way for us? How often do we speak of the sacrifices that they have made? How often do we recount the stories of the good and the aspirations our parents brought into the world and what we learned from them? And do we know even anything about a generation before that? Do we know what our grandparents tried to do to create a better future for our parents? What did everybody do so that the generations after them had a better chance to thrive? I bet we barely speak of that. So how in the world are our kids going to speak of the good that we bring into the world if we don't model that for them and speak of the good that our ancestors brought? And so each generation is imbued with all of the gifts of those who have come before, but each generation still thinks of themselves as a self-made generation. It's such an American value. We hear people say, this is a self-made man, this is a self-made woman, as if nothing went before, as if nobody gave them any of the gifts, any of the resources that they needed to become who they were. It's actually quite exhausting to think that everything you want to generate, you have to generate out of your own body, versus knowing that there's been people who have generated a lot before us. And when we can lean into that, it actually may bring us a sense of gratefulness and of gratitude. So within the African tradition, there is a way to honor those who have come before, especially during Kwanzaa, so that we may harvest the wisdom that so many people have brought into the world, and so that we may teach the next generation that they're not alone, that there are powerful ancestors who have fought for freedom and justice and liberation and the greater good of all. Now, as we are talking, I'm wondering if people have come to your mind that have inspired you, that you have thought of as somebody that you would like to emulate, as somebody that has brought gifts into your life. Have you thought of anybody? If you have, would you speak their name out loud? We can do it all at the same time. Who have you thought of? So let's speak of people. Let's speak of people who brought us what they have brought us. Some of us are challenged with the question, since Kwanzaa is a holiday created for and by African Americans,
can anybody observe Kwanzaa? Or should they?
There is, of course, the danger of co-opting a tradition, which we are good at, using it for our own personal gain without even knowing the history out of which that tradition came, without even knowing the struggles that have gone on so that a tradition has been created. It is different when we are willing to walk more closely into the history of that particular tradition.
I've had the privilege of being able to be a part of the history and the experience of some traditions that have connected with Elisabeth. Her mother called probably 15, 16 years ago when we were first together and said, "It's the time of silence." And she doesn't speak English, and so I was translating, wondering, was I understanding her incorrectly? And so I asked Elisabeth, what was the time of silence? And she said,
On May 4th, we remember the liberation of the German occupation, but even more so, we remember all those that have fallen during that time. And at 8 o'clock in the evening, for 1 minute, the whole country falls quiet and stops as much as possible. Get off our phones, stop talking, and there's a minute of silence. And we observe that every year on May 4th at 8 o'clock.
And it was so not a part of me because we don't do that kind of thing here in the same way. And for me to learn about that and to learn the history, to understand the background, and then to put myself there, I thought, wow. And it's not my story.
But it was my story.
But I would have never understood had I not experienced that moment. And I'll give you another one that she told me not to tell. Elisabeth was instrumental in starting one of the first warming shelters in Guerneville, and people were sleeping underneath the bridge there, and the bridge was right next to the church. And she became real adamant that they needed to get off the street because it was getting colder. And the very first night that the shelter opened, there wasn't anyone to be there with the homeless people, and that was a part of the requirement to opening up the hall for them to stay. And so I got a phone call, and she said, "I'm not coming home." And I knew that the "I'm not coming home" meant that she was going to be that person because there needed to be someone. And I don't know that I would have immediately jumped into that and said, yes, I will. I think it would have scared me a little bit. But her connection to the homeless population there has been so strong, and in San Francisco has been so strong, that she stepped into that place. And by virtue of that, it gave me the understanding and the experience that I needed to have a different understanding and vantage point. I needed to be in that story, even though it wasn't my story. And I knew that she was going to stay there until there was someone else to be there so that the people who were there were safe.
She wasn't going to say that,
I
but she
wasn't.
did anyway. Cindy said that the ideas behind Kwanzaa was the restoration of personhood, even more so the restoration of a whole people, and the conviction that the restoration is everyone's or no one's. So in our society, in our world, so much is about personal gain, about greed, about the gains for just a small group of people. And we see how that leaves millions of people just struggling to survive within the US, at our borders, outside of the US. It leaves them in the dust. And we also see that our natural world is under siege. And I'm saying this in answering the question, should we all celebrate Kwanzaa? Because we don't really have a vision or practices that show us how to take care of a larger whole, how to work for the greater good, how to make that greater good accessible to all. We need the wisdom held within the African communities. We need the wisdom held within other indigenous communities who still hold such a vision. We need Kwanzaa and the principles of Kwanzaa to work towards the greater good for all. And remember, our first task in approaching another people, another tradition, is to take off our shoes, for the place we are approaching is holy.
The South African proverb, and I've shared a part of this before, Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. And the other side of that is we are because I am. We have to remember that something created the need for Kwanzaa. That something was cultural racism. If there was none, there would have been no need to have a Kwanzaa, a lifting up of one's culture and one's race. But oppression and racism demanded something for the survival of a people whose identity was being eliminated and saturated. It was created for a people. It was created for African Americans to restore and retain who they are. But it's not only African Americans who need internal work, who need the work to raise themselves up out of traumatic, abusive, oppressive situations. It's everyone who needs to learn how to work and reflect those principles and how to recreate and redefine community and to honor and respect all cultures. If they were in place from the start, we would all be doing good. We would have honored the culture. We would have honored our waymakers and stepped into their shoes. But now we're called upon to make that difference and hold it tight, to be inclusive in our doing good, which is the theme for Kwanzaa this year, and for Nia, for today, this day of purpose, to bring inclusive good into the world, to recognize community, to strengthen our culture, and to maintain joy and change amid a challenging world.
As South African social rights activist and Archbishop Desmond Tutu explained, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together.
So just before we do the denial and affirmation, I want to tell you that tomorrow is creativity, and I call on you to start to think about how you can use your talents, your artistry, your design, the things that you may not have thought you could do as human beings to contribute to the greater good in the world. And finally, faith, which is on New Year's, which is faith in oneself, faith in others, faith in the community, faith in the world. The denial, can you say it with us? I will not close my eyes to the need for liberation of others. And with your joy, the affirmation, I will dare to interrupt the negativity of the world with my joy. Yes. Amen.
Do this. Wow.